By now, you must have watched the other lectures that I delivered on literary studies in this channel, and you might be familiar with my way of looking at certain topics, approaching certain topics, and this particular series that I am going to start with this video of today concerns itself with the entrance tests that the students of English honors at the UG level appear for, right? So I'm going to focus primarily on the topic known as literary theory, and I prepared these lectures for my students in my college when the outgoing batch of the current semester requested me to deliver a few lectures on literary theory because they were applying for the MA entrance tests in various universities. So, to begin with, we have to understand the purpose of these entrance tests. First of all, the purpose is to eliminate and to distinguish. So first, purpose A is to put you out of the group. The examiners want to eliminate you from the rest of the group, from the cream. And also the second purpose is they want to distinguish among the brighter students and the other students. So that is the purpose. They try to eliminate and try to distinguish among students, among the examinees. And that's why these tests are usually very, very difficult. Now, what do we lack actually? And I'm speaking on behalf of the student community in general who want to crack such entrance tests after completing their graduations in English. They want to go for masters and they want to crack examinations. So what do they lack actually? First of all is a particular competence in understanding and articulation. These are the two things which you have to focus. Whether you understand a thing, grasp a thing well enough, and then whether you can reproduce it in your own words. So for that you need articulation, and for this purpose you have to practice in a rigorous manner. Whatever you are reading, you have to cultivate it, you have to reproduce it in your own words. That's what I used to do when I prepared for UGC NET. And then another factor is that which I have seen in the community of students around me, is that they are prone to examination oriented selective reading, and most of them succumb to the dominant quote unquote note culture which prevails around the entire student community. So they focus on certain notes which are to be abhorred, because note culture would not lead you to insightful things. Note culture would not give you any insight. Note culture would not help you develop writing skill, develop the skills of understanding, develop the skill of articulation. It is not going to help. Usually the note culture which prevails around me is, I'm very sorry to say, it's appalling actually. And I never had any tuitions during my graduation days and master's days because it was not required. My teachers used to teach us so well, and we used to study so many things on our own, and that's why we never needed that kind of note oriented selective reading. So these factors are to be eliminated from our lives. right? Now, what are the probable remedies for this? First is you have to develop your writing skill with rigorous practice. You have to continuously write and show it to someone. Whatever you are writing, show it to your teacher and then get it corrected. That's what I used to do during my student days. And then obviously it is not required for the exams which are taken in MCQ mode. And you have to acquire knowledge of seminal texts in literature, the texts which are canonical in nature, and also knowledge of significant literary and socio-cultural movements. Also, you have to have the knowledge of basic tenets of every age in the history of English literature and beyond. So, literature in English and English literature, both these segments are to be taken care of. Especially if you think of the MA entrance test these days, they also focus on the literature which are getting produced in the non-English countries, like the African countries or the Asian countries. So that's why you have to go beyond. And knowledge of literary theories, which is also very, very essential. For knowledge of seminal texts in literature, what you can do is you collect the BA, MA English syllabi of different universities, which are considered to be very, very standard, very up to the mark. And nowadays we have this CBCS template given by the UGC, and you can download that template and go through all the texts. There you will have a key to understand each and every component of literature in English and English literature. Read facts on file companions which are available. They are extremely useful. Make notes age wise, so you have to have a knowledge of the zeitgeist of each and every age. So suppose you might be knowing about Renaissance, but what is Renaissance actually, and why it is also known as the early modern period? So you have to know the crux of it. You have to know the basic tenets of each and every age, or how, for that matter, the Victorian age is different from the modern period. How it is, how are they different? Or for that matter, what do we mean by Romanticism? So you have to have the knowledge of each and every age in an in-depth manner. Now, for the knowledge of significant literary and socio-cultural movements and basic tenets of every age, you can read any standard book on the history of English literature and make notes, and also read very short introduction series which are published by Oxford, and also make notes from those texts, which are very, very useful. There are plenty of introductions available by the publisher named Routledge, where you have critical insights in a very student-friendly manner into several relevant topics. And for knowledge of literary theories, you can read Peter Barry or Raman Selden or any books from reputed publishing houses before going to the actual primary texts. And it would be great if you read all the primary texts by the important theoreticians. You can also watch the Yale online lectures, which are delivered by Paul Fry. In fact, Paul Fry has also published a book on literary theories, which is very, very useful. And of course, watch my videos. Now, the topics that I would try to cover, I cannot give you the promise. I cannot make any promise that I would be able to cover all the topics one after another because of the lack of time. However, I would try to give you brief ideas about all these things in my lectures throughout the series that I'm starting with this one. So postmodernism, and with that we would study the rise of literary theories. We would have new criticism, formalism, structuralism, reader response theory or reception theory. Then post-structuralism would come and deconstruction would come. We would have new historicism and also cultural materialism. And then certain other eclectic movements would be there, like Marxism, feminism, psychoanalysis, post-colonialism, and eco-criticism, and so on. Now, before going into the specific theories, let us first understand what is theory. Because many a time I have seen that students get confused regarding this particular idea, that what actually this theory, this particular word theory mean. What actually does it mean? What does it entail? We do not know properly most of the time. So to begin with, we have to consider that theory actually approximates philosophy. Now, it is not equivalent to philosophy, it is an approximation of philosophy, which is the rational investigation of questions about existence and knowledge and ethics. So that is what philosophy is. And theory approximates philosophy to a great extent. And in particular, it is similar to metaphysics, which is the philosophical study of being and knowing. So both epistemology and ontology, both are included in this idea of metaphysics. And in the 20th century, literary theory, quote unquote literary theory, this phrase refers to a particular way of looking at literary texts. And towards the end of the 20th century, we have the rise of culture studies, so cultural texts as well. Right? And this literary theory is marked by skepticism. As we know that the very idea of rationality came under scrutiny with the idea of skepticism. Right? So, with this rise of theory, which happened in the 20th century, we have an unprecedented challenge to the very foundations of knowing, being, and thinking. Right? So, previously, people used to think about life, think about knowledge, and think about thinking itself in a markedly different way. And that way got challenged. The foundations of that way of knowing things, the way of thinking about certain things, and the way of leading life changed or came under scrutiny with the rise of literary theory, theory with capital T. And what are the questions that literary theories ask? Literary theories primarily ask questions such as, what is literature? That is to say, is literature a particular use of language? Is it the mindscape of the author? That is, author produces literature, author produces literary works? Or is it a product of socio-political history? So different literary theories would focus on different questions. For instance, new critics or formalists would focus on the first question. Is it a particular use of language? Especially formalists. They would think that yes, literature is a special use of language. While the psychoanalytic critics would try to focus on the mindscape of the author, how the author would think, how the author would conceptualize certain matters, and why would the author do that. And they would focus on the psychology of the author. And on the other hand, we have the Marxist criticism, for instance, which would primarily focus on the socio-political history, the climate, the socio-political cultural climate in which a literary text would be produced, and how that climate would condition the literary text or shape the literary text. Now, I have grossly summarized, and this summary is very, very gross in nature. Later on, we would try to have specific understanding of these theories. For the sake of understanding at the very basic level, I am trying to distinguish among these theories in this fashion. And also, literary theories may ask, how is literature produced and consumed? And for that matter, they would ask, what is an author? What is the function of the author? What does the reader do? So here we have reader response theorists. What is an author is a very, very famous essay by Michel Foucault, who would focus on the idea of author function. We would try to highlight that as well in my subsequent lectures, that what does Foucault mean by author function. Now let us try to distinguish between two things. One is literary theory and another is literary criticism. They are two different things. Literary theory is concerned more with speculation, analysis and description rather than appreciation and evaluation, while literary criticism is primarily concerned with the evaluation and appreciation of literature. For instance, how this literary work is valuable. This pertains to criticism. Criticism would tell you whether this is a valuable work or not. If you are saying this is a good work, this is a bad work, you are evaluating. So you are doing literary criticism. So criticism would be about giving judgment, evaluating certain things, appreciating certain things. While why this criticism values this literary work in this particular way, if you ask this question, this pertains to theory, literary theory. So theory would, in other words, focus on the speculative framework, the analytical framework, which would condition certain thought process, why it is happening, why the critic is thinking that this literary work is worthy. If this is the question, then you are thinking as a literary theorist, right? And literary criticism, for its value-laden functionality, often forms a canon of some sort. So there would be a canon of literary works. So some literary works would be valued, some literary works would not be valued or undermined, right, or undervalued because of certain critical frameworks which would prevail in certain ages. For instance, if you think of John Donne was not a very canonical poet, not a canonical poet at all, until T.S. Eliot, a towering poetic genius in the early 20th century in the West, came up with his valorization of John Donne and the metaphysical poets. Right, so John Donne was often considered by critics of the earlier times as not a very good poet. Right? But it was T.S. Eliot who would focus on John Donne's qualities, certain qualities that are admirable, the way in which he ushers in the process of cerebration or intellection, right? The way in which he unifies certain sensibilities, be it religious sentiments or sensibilities or romantic sensibilities or completely physical sensibilities. He would combine them together in this way. So, and the way in which he would combine would entail cerebration, intellection. So that actually got Donne famous, made Donne very, very famous, got everyone's attention. And literary theory, for its inherent skepticism, often questions its very own structure and historicity. Right? So literary theory is very, very skeptical in nature. Literary criticism would come up with assurance. This is good, this is bad. It would be very, very clear in literary criticism, while literary theory would not be so sure. It would be very, very skeptical in nature. Right? So it would be even skeptical of its own historicity, own structure. So the origin of skepticism and speculation, which I have been talking about, and I have been associating this with literary theory. Let us talk about that. What is the origin of this skepticism that we find in literary theory? So it can be traced back to the emergence of modernity itself. And modernity, by this particular word, I'm referring to the consciousness of being modern. So you can definitely watch my video on modernity, modern, and modernism in this very channel itself, and you would come to know about modernity in detail. Here I would not talk about modernity in detail. So the origin of modernity would also include the origin of skepticism and speculation that we find in literary theory. So for this particular thing, we have to refer to Edmund Husserl. Now, Edmund Husserl famously conceptualizes modernity as a pursuit that is akin to the Cartesian philosophy and science that would enable human beings to master nature. So you have a direct connection with the Enlightenment ideas about nature, about human beings, right? So Cartesian, he refers to the French rationalist René Descartes. And in this way, modernity is inextricably linked with the Enlightenment, which is the pan-European philosophical movement of the 17th century, which was predicated upon the idea that reason and scientific pursuits can free humans from the tyranny and dogma. So from the tyranny of kings and the dogma which are propagated by the corrupt priests and religious figures. So enlightenment is about going away from religious dogma, going away from political tyranny. However, this idea of enlightenment got challenged in the later period, especially in the 20th century, where Adorno Horkheimer would come up with their critique in the dialectic of enlightenment, where the enlightenment would be projected as a mass deception. So we probably would be able to talk about these things in the subsequent lectures, and there the critique of modernity and everything comes into play. You can go through my lectures on the modernist writers, so that you would understand how this idea of modernity, which is extremely inextricably linked with the idea of enlightenment, extremely relevant to understand enlightenment, got critiqued by several writers and artists of the 20th century. And the origin of skepticism and speculation, we were talking about that. So coming back to that, we have to refer to the famous Cartesian phrase, I think, therefore I am. That is to say, I think about other things, and this is how all the things exist for me. So I think, therefore all the things that I am thinking about can be understood by me to exist. So I think, therefore I am. That means I think, and that's why all the other things around me exist for me. And this Cartesian revolution was one of the mainstays of the Enlightenment, as we already know. This is a very, very famous phrase, very oft-quoted phrase, which is attributed to René Descartes, who is one of the rationalist thinkers of the Enlightenment. And the idea that there is a distance between mind, where we have the seer, the observer or the subject, and the thing, which is observed, the seen, the object, that the mind conceptualizes. So this Enlightenment idea of knowing things, about thinking about things, creates this binary through this distance between the mind and the thing. And there has to be a particular distance too far or too near would not work. To observe a certain thing properly. So if you want to know about a particular thing, you have to maintain a proper distance. You cannot go too far, you cannot go too near. But this very idea of proper understanding, the certitude of knowing, which was the mainstay of the Enlightenment, especially in the 17th and 18th centuries, got challenged by another Enlightenment thinker, Immanuel Kant. And Kant, in Prolegomena, argues, and I quote, "And we indeed, rightly considering objects of sense as mere appearances, confess thereby that they are based upon a thing in itself, though we know not this thing as it is in itself, but only know its appearances," which is the way in which our senses are affected by this unknown something. So here we have the origin of skepticism and speculation. Basically, what Kant means is that we cannot know the thing in itself. What we are knowing is that just the appearances of the things. So we indeed rightly are considering the objects of sense as mere appearances, and thereby we confess that they are based upon a thing in itself, though we know not this thing as it is in itself, but only its appearances. So we can only know about the appearances of the thing, how they appear. That is what is important. We cannot know a thing in itself. And we have this full-fledged assault on consciousness, the idea of consciousness, human consciousness, the idea of subjectivity, the idea of thinking self, the unified self, all came under assault when Charles Darwin in the mid-19th century implied humans were closer to animals than a god, and human lives are mostly determined by the so-called animalistic impulses, that is reproduction and survival of the fittest, and so on and so forth. And then we have further assaults by Marx and Engels in the mid-19th century, who argued that social, historical and economic factors, which are surely beyond our control, delude our consciousness. So what we suppose to be our own authentic ideas are actually conditioned by the quote-unquote ideology. And here ideology refers to the frameworks through which human beings know about things. And a dominant ideology caters to interest of the ruling class. So this is how Marx and Engels brings the dimension of class and history into our understanding, that how our understanding is always conditioned by the larger frameworks which are historically determined, and these frameworks are known as ideology. And mostly these ideologies have two types. They are dominant and subordinate, and dominant ideology would be definitely conditioning most of the ideas which are in circulation in a particular age, and this dominant ideology mostly caters to the interest of the ruling class, the powerful people in the society. And then we have also Nietzsche in the late 19th century, who argued, what then is truth? A mobile army of metaphors, metonymies, anthropomorphisms, in short, a sum of human relations which became poetically and rhetorically intensified, and are now no longer of account as coins, but are debased. So he is actually challenging the way in which we understand something to be true. What is truth? Truth is a mobile army of metaphors, metonymies, anthropomorphisms, nothing else. So truth would vary from person to person, from age to age, from one ideology to another. And then Sigmund Freud in the late 19th century assaulted the idea of unified self, because he argued that our mind is divided in id, ego and superego, and the unconscious is continuously undermining our consciousness. So again an assault on human consciousness comes. And the speculative frameworks which are now known as quote-unquote theories with capital T were influenced by the various discourses of skepticism that we find in Marx, Nietzsche, Freud, and many others. So that's why in What is an Author, Foucault would call Marx, Nietzsche, Freud to be founders of discursivity. They were not authors, they were founders of discursivity. They presented us a particular ground of discourse where we could talk about several things without being dependent upon a particular ideological framework. So we may talk about these things in detail in our subsequent lectures. So the full-fledged assault on cognition became a hallmark of the age known as postmodern. So postmodernism is also having the origin in Marx, Nietzsche, Freud, and others who assaulted the idea of human consciousness and meaning generation and how things appear to us. Right. So in the next lecture, we would focus on new criticism, which is not part of the quote-unquote theory per se with capital T, but new criticism is a gateway to theory, you can say. Right. So hope you have liked this video and learned from it. If you have questions, you can definitely email those questions to me. I would be extremely happy to answer them. We would meet in the next video. Thanks a lot.